One of the worst ways to interpret the Bible, and unfortunately this is a surprisingly common way for people to interpret the Bible for some rather dark reasons that we'll talk about in just a second, but one of the worst ways to interpret the Bible is to pretend like you're not actually interpreting the Bible at all. Other people, the people you disagree with, those people are interpreting the Bible, but you are doing something much simpler than that. Other people are interpreting in light of their social context. Other people are bringing their demographics and their identity and their personal experience to the table when they interpret. Other people are trying to negotiate with the text and make intentional choices about how they harmonize this or that passage. Other people are trying to balance the needs of their interpretive community with their own personal desires for how they want to make sense of the text. Other people are doing these things, but you're special. You're not doing those things. No, you are just looking at the text. You are just reading the words on the page. You are just thinking hard about what's in front of you. That's all you're doing. Demure, mindful. You're doing something much simpler. For example,
that is not how I create my doctrine. See, I create my doctrine, or rather I form my doctrine based off of looking at the revelation that God has provided for us and then either inferring things based off that or thinking critically about that. I don't just sit down and negotiate what I want to be the case.
The problem here is that looking at the text and thinking critically about the text are both ways of interpreting and negotiating with the text, and both of these, consciously or not, are affected by our social experience and our personal desires. Everyone knows about confirmation bias. When we look at anything in the world, especially things on which we have a lot writing, what we see is a combination of both what's there and what we have been taught to expect to see, which is that social dimension, that experiential dimension. And when somebody is thinking critically, it's an important question to ask, who taught you how to think critically? For what purposes and for what ends? People don't think critically in a vacuum, especially in a context of biblical and theological study. Looking and thinking are social phenomena that involve as much interpretation and negotiation as anything else. Here we have a quote from the former president of the Society of Biblical Literature, Walter Brueggemann, and his book, Texts Under Negotiation, the Bible and Postmodern Imagination. Our knowing is inherently contextual. This should hardly come to us as a surprise. Descartes wanted to insist that context was not relevant to knowing. It is, however, now clear that what one knows and sees depends upon where one stands or sits. This matter of contextualism is of particular interest to those who practice something like a liberation hermeneutic. Indeed, such voices are often dismissed as context-conditioned. Such voices of interpretation, however, do not pretend otherwise. They do not deny the power of context in their discernment. They want to insist only that as their own view is contextual, so also is every other view, including those that claim to be objective and non-contextual. Contextualism argues that the knower helps constitute what is known, that the socioeconomic, political reality of the knower is decisive for knowledge. Just like the title of his book, Texts Under Negotiation, says, we are always negotiating with these texts, whether we claim to be or not. Here's another quote along the same lines, also from a former president of the Society of Biblical Literature, Fernando Segovia, in his book, Decolonizing Biblical Studies. Here he's also talking about biblical scholars' increasing recognition of the contextual dimension of interpretation. This new development posits instead a very different construct, the flesh and blood reader, always positioned and interested, socially and historically conditioned, and unable to transcend such conditions to attain a sort of asocial, ahistorical nirvana, not only with respect to socioeconomic class, but also with regard to the many factors that make up human identity. Again, our looking and our thinking are socially, historically conditioned, and as a result, we are always negotiating with these texts, trying to balance personal desire and preconception and a host of other factors. And again, we cannot escape from this situation just by looking or thinking harder than everybody else. How then did we reach this situation where so many people think that it's others that are interpreting, but not them? They are somehow exempt from all these forces that affect their interpretations. Unfortunately, a big part of the answer to that question is racism and the intellectual trends that descend from that racism. Here's a quote from an essay written by Gail Yee, also former president of the Society of Biblical Literature. Here she says, "Many white people do not consciously see themselves or their conceptual frameworks as raced. Instead of acknowledging its own socio-historical production, whiteness sets itself up as the universal norm, disparaging all others as aberrations. Those who are white often fail to see how their racial position predetermines the social realities of which they are a part. Because whiteness functions incognito in our society, the burden of explaining and justifying racial difference is placed upon the hyphenated, racialized individuals themselves. This is why in both biblical studies and theology we have black theology, feminist theology, mujerista theology, womanist theology, Latin American liberation theology, queer theology, etc., all these hyphenated groups by scholars who are happy to recognize the effect that context has on their interpretations of biblical texts, but on that list of contextual approaches to interpretation and theology, there is no white theology, white biblical studies, because the presumption is, amongst many people who practiced it, that it is the default that requires no justification. This then trickles down in white evangelical and fundamentalist spaces and makes people think, no, it's all those other people over there, those hyphenated special interest groups. They're the ones doing the interpretation and the negotiation. I'm over here just looking, just thinking, just doing actual, real biblical studies and theology. If you'd like an entire book tracing the history of white supremacy, the doctrines of biblical inerrancy and infallibility, and the tendency of many Bible readers to assume that their context does not matter and they're just reading and not interpreting the text, then I would strongly recommend this book by Angela Parker, no doubt future president of the Society of Biblical Literature, called If God Still Breathes, Why Can't I?